Olá, essa entrevista que você irá assistir agora foi financiada pela Federação Europeia de Neurociências. Essa entrevista também foi disponibilizada para nós e autorizada a sua republicação pelo canal Psislabs. E também tivemos a autorização do próprio Dr. Mark Solms para estar publicando essa entrevista para atingir o nosso público e a nossa comunidade de estudos em neuropsicanálise. Essa entrevista visa trazer um pouco da perspectiva e do estudo aprofundado que o Dr. Solms tem sobre os trabalhos neurocientíficos e psicológicos de Sigmund Freud. Se você tem dúvidas sobre como a neuropsicanálise propõe rever vários conceitos freudianos, acreditamos que através dessa breve entrevista você terá uma profunda noção do que a neurociência tem a contribuir com a neuropsicanálise e vice-versa. Se você é psicanalista, terapeuta, psicólogo e tem desejo em conhecer mais sobre neuropsicanálise, junte-se à nossa comunidade de estudos em neuropsicanálise. A nossa comunidade é profundamente baseada no estudo e pesquisa do Dr. Mark Solms, o qual eu mesmo faço a minha supervisão e também a minha pesquisa neuropsicanalítica. Além do trabalho do Dr. Solms, também temos como base em nossos estudos e pesquisas clínicas o trabalho do Dr. Jack Panksehl, que é o criador da neurociência afetiva. Portanto, se você deseja ter uma psicanálise revisitada pelas neurociências, que sempre foi a base, a fonte da própria psicanálise, convidamos você a fazer um de nossos cursos ou adquirir os nossos livros e publicações em neuropsicanálise. Para ter acesso a mais materiais, é só acessar o link que eu vou deixar aqui embaixo. Uma ótima entrevista e que isso possa ampliar o seu conhecimento acerca do que significa neuropsicanálise.
Neste vídeo, gostaríamos de vos apresentar uma perspectiva frequentemente desconhecida sobre Sigmund Freud, o seu trabalho como neurocientista e neurologista. De facto, antes de teorizar sobre os processos inconscientes, cognitivos e afetivos, ele foi um dos muitos pioneiros esquecidos da neurobiologia e da neurologia. Há algumas semanas, tivemos o prazer de conhecer Mark Solms. Mark Solms é neuropsicólogo e psicanalista. É titular da Cátedra de Neuropsicologia na Universidade da Cidade do Cabo e é presidente da Associação Psicanalítica da África do Sul. Atualmente, é também presidente de investigação da Associação Psicanalítica Internacional e diretor da reedição inglesa das obras completas de Sigmund Freud. Fundou a Sociedade Internacional de Neuropsicanálise em 2000 e foi um dos editores fundadores da revista Neuropsychoanalysis.
First of all, Freud was not only a neurologist, but first a neuroscientist. And in fact, his neuroscientific work covered a very wide spectrum. He started out as a histologist, trying to understand or discern the structure of the nerve cell. And that work he did in invertebrates, river crayfish. Then he moved to vertebrates, and he moved to looking at fiber pathways in the spinal cord and in the brainstem. And so as he moved up toward the brainstem, he also moved from invertebrates to vertebrates to human beings. He started to study human fetuses, a very interesting method that they were using at that time that was pioneered by Flechsig. And then he became a neurologist after doing some important work on the anatomy of the brainstem. And started making contributions to clinical neurology, especially to to cerebral palsy, the study of and classification of movement disorders in children, and ultimately to neuropsychology. He made two really important works in neuropsychology. The one was his zur Auffassung der Aphasien, the interpretation of the aphasias, which was published in 1891, was a critique of the Wernicke-Lichtheim classification and conceptualization of the aphasias. It was a very deep and intelligent criticism of localizationism, of the need for a more dynamic conception, more of a network approach to the classification of the aphasias and the understanding of the brain mechanisms of language. That laid the foundations for dynamic neuropsychological views that came later, like, for example, Alexander Romanovich Luria. His approach was very much in the tradition of Freud. There's an interesting thing about Luria, which is that he was, in his youth, he was not a psychoanalyst because there was no psychoanalytic training in Russia at that time, but he was a member of the Moscow Psychoanalytical Society. In fact, he was the secretary of the society, and before that, he was the president of the Kazan Psychoanalytical Society, which is a far eastern city in Russia. And he wrote to Freud when he founded that society, and so there was a very small correspondence between Luria and Freud. And it's clear that Luria was deeply imbued with psychodynamic ways of thinking. He was very much involved in the scientific life of the Moscow Psychoanalytical Society until the early 1930s. All of a sudden, Luria writes, psychoanalysis is a bourgeois science. Psychoanalysis reduces complex social historical processes to biology, and he resigns from the Moscow Psychoanalytical Society. And that is only because of politics. It became frankly dangerous to your life if you were a supporter of psychoanalysis by the 1930s, when Stalin decided that psychoanalysis was scientia non grata. And so it was a public mea culpa by Luria in order to be able to literally survive. But if you follow the ideas in Luria's whole approach to neuropsychology was very dynamic. It was very steeped in psychoanalytical ways of thinking and psychoanalytical ways of working. The whole approach to neuropsychological evaluation of Luria is a flexible, individualized, clinical approach, as opposed to the American approach of standardized batteries of tests and measurement and so on. There was a funny trick. There was a book called The Great Soviet Encyclopedia, and Luria wrote the entry in that encyclopedia about psychoanalysis. And the opening sentences are something like, psychoanalysis is a bourgeois science, blah, 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 but this is what they say. And then he writes this beautiful, sophisticated analysis of psychoanalytical ideas. But you first have to say that they're bourgeois, then you can say them afterwards. The other great contribution was his project for a scientific psychology. Although it was never published at that time, it was only published in 1950. It was a remarkable synthesis, way ahead of its time, because it incorporated not only cognition, perception, learning, consciousness, but also affect, motivation. It was a truly integrated conceptualization of the brain of the kind that we're only now, again, 100 years later, beginning to try to develop. There were several ideas in the project which were truly prescient. One of them was the concept of a synapse. Sherrington had not yet described the synapse. This was in 1895. Freud called them contact barriers. He conceptualized there being a gap between the neurons. He thought that this gap was important for where learning mechanisms occur, memory. And in that sense, he presaged not only the synapse concept, but also Hebbian learning. The concept of neurons that fire together, wire together, it's there in 1895. Hebb's book was published in 1949, The Organization of Behavior. The idea of how cognition relates to affect. Freud said in the project that the brain is a sympathetic ganglion, and that in other words, that cognitive processes operate in sympathy with the demands of the body upon the mental instrument to perform work. So it was I think few would disagree that Freud's greatest contribution to neuroscience was the project for a scientific psychology. Many people say so. Brazier, Mary Brazier, in her History of Neurophysiology, she accredits Freud as being a pioneer of the neuron theory. There's a book by Shepard, was published in the 1990s. The title of the book is The Neuron Theory, and there's a whole chapter on Freud's contribution. I have to say, I think that Freud's contribution was not so great to the development of the neuron theory. If you actually look at the papers that he wrote on the topic, the thing that he was most concerned with was the continuity between the cell body and the cell process. In other words, what we would now call the axon and the nucleus of the cell body of the neuron. At the time that Freud was working in the field, it wasn't even clear whether what they called the fibers connecting the nerve cells and the nerve cells themselves, it wasn't even clear that that was a structural and functional unit. Certainly Freud recognized that the cell body and the axon is a functional unit. What he did not at that time in those papers, those histological papers, he did not have any conception of the synapse at that point. So the crucial issue in the neuron theory is not that the cell body and the axon and of course the dendrites are a single unit, but that there is a discontinuity between each neuron. Freud didn't show any awareness of that in his histological papers. Although, as I said, in his later project, and that was 10 years later, in his 1895 project, at that point he clearly did understand or anticipate the concept of a synapse, but it was based on theoretical considerations. It was not based on histological observations of his own. Charcot was an enormous influence on Freud. I think many people don't realize that the reason that Freud went to study under Charcot was not because he wanted to learn about hysteria or hypnosis. It was because he wanted to learn the clinico-pathological method of Charcot. At that time in the 1880s, there were two major schools of neurology. There was the German-speaking school, the Austro-Hungarian and German approach was very theoretical and very reductionist, like the Wernicke-Lichtheim theory of language. It was highly theoretical, based on conceptions of brain centers and association pathways, which were largely fictional. Nowadays people speak of that as brain mythology, that they had ideas derived from philosophy of mind, actually. Charcot's approach was much less theoretical, much less reductionistic, much more clinical and descriptive. Charcot's view was that all that one has to do is to carefully observe and describe and differentiate between different clinical presentations during life. Then you wait for the death of the patient. At autopsy, you make equally detailed observations on the pathology, and you relate the clinical condition to the underlying pathology. This was his approach. And Freud said in the letter that he wrote when he applied for the travel grant, which was what brought him to Paris, he got a bursary to study under Charcot. He said that's what he wants to study under Charcot for. He says he's learned everything that there is to learn from the German approach. Now he wants to study the French approach. And I think that was the single most important influence that Charcot had on Freud. Because when it comes to the neuroses, by definition, there is no physiological, there's no lesion, there's no physiological abnormality. The approach of taking a purely clinical observational perspective that Charcot imparted to Freud as a neurologist, that same perspective that Charcot took in relation to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and multiple sclerosis and so on, he could use exactly the same approach in describing neurotic conditions. Whereas in Germany, if there's no physiology, no pathophysiology, then there's no disease.
Hysteria is another name for lying. Peter, there's no therapy for that. You will see to it personally, Herr Freud. This bed is vacated at once.
That clinical descriptive approach of Charcot was what enabled Freud to make that transition. It so happened that at that time, Charcot was himself applying his method to the study of hysteria, and hypnosis, of course, was part of that. So Freud became interested in those topics secondarily. I think that that was a consequence of the clinico-descriptive approach of Charcot. So the reason that Freud gave in his application as to why he wants to study under Charcot is also, I think, the reason why Charcot had such an enormous influence on him. Neuropsychoanalysis is, I think, the natural development of psychoanalysis. If you look at the origins of psychoanalysis, Freud was a neurologist, he was a neuroscientist who became interested in neuropsychology in the sense that he wanted to understand the lived life of the mind, which is, after all, the most interesting thing about the brain, what differentiates the brain from other organs. The single distinction about the brain is that it has a subjective, conscious intentionality. These are the most interesting things about this organ. It's absolutely remarkable. So Freud was interested in that, but there were no tools. There were no techniques or no methods in the 1890s when he was first developing this field of trying to bring into science, to bring into natural science, things that exist in nature, like feelings, like the self, like consciousness. All of these things are not only exist, but they're fascinating. They are our very identities. That's what we are. We are our feeling, sentient selves. When Freud wanted to bring all of that into science, there were no physiological or anatomical, no objective natural science tools for studying these things. So he very reluctantly said the only way we can study these things is by purely psychological methods. So psychoanalysis was a development from neuropsychology or from behavioral neurology or the cognitive neuroscience of that time, such as it was. It was ironically a more scientific approach. It was more empirically grounded than the pure speculations, which were the only other. Because there were no observational techniques that were anatomical and physiological, you had to speculate about what were the anatomical and physiological mechanisms of the mind. And there was plenty of speculation that went on. Freud's great teacher, Theodor Meinert, was the example. It's really ridiculous what fantasies he came up with about how the mind is grounded in brain processes. Freud's view was the only way we can study these things empirically is psychologically. And so the whole of psychoanalysis was an interim approach. And Freud made this very clear. He said, for the present, we have to use purely psychological methods and concepts. But at some point, we will have to bring this back into neuroscience. Really, Freud was very clear about this. He said it over and over again. One day, all of this will be rejoined with neuroscience. So now, in our time, since the 1980s and 1990s in particular, we started to develop technologies where we can study mental processes from their physical point of view. You know, think, for example, just of the functional neuroimaging technologies, let alone everything else that we have these days. There is therefore no reason for us to say we can't study the lived complexity and subtlety of the active, intentional agent of the mind. We can study it physiologically and anatomically. And that's what neuropsychoanalysis tries to do. Neuropsychoanalysis is simply the means by which we reincorporate all of the psychological knowledge that Freud and his approach brought to us. Everything you can learn about the brain from the point of view of subjective methods and subjective concepts. And remember what I said, the subjectivity of the brain is its most unique attribute. So it's not a small little detail. to bring the lived life of the mind, as Freud conceptualized it psychologically, to bring that back into neuroscience in order for us to subject those theories to scrutiny and testability with contemporary neuroscientific methods. That's the aim of neuropsychoanalysis. So if I can just say the same thing again very simply, the aim of neuropsychoanalysis is first of all to bring the subjective, agent, intentional self into neuroscience on the one hand, and on the other hand to bring the scientific rigor of neuroscience into psychoanalysis, so that we don't have to have a dualistic conception of the mind and the brain anymore. You know, we think in neuropsychology that we don't have a dualistic conception, that we've already brought the mind into neuroscience with neuropsychology, but really it's not true. If you look at what neuropsychology is actually about, it's more like neurobehaviorism than neuropsychology. You know, it's neuroinformation processing, or it's not actually bringing into neuroscience the real stuff of the mind that we all experience ourselves to be. That's the interesting part, that's the complex part, that's what psychoanalysis is about, and we no longer have any excuse to not bring this true, full richness of the life of the mind into neuroscience. That's what neuropsychoanalysis is trying to do.
Novamente, agradecemos ao Dr. Mark Solms, ao canal PsisLabs e à Federação Europeia de Neurociências pela autorização e disponibilidade desse caro conteúdo. Novamente, se você é terapeuta, psicanalista e tem desejo em conhecer mais sobre a neuropsicanálise, baseado especificamente no trabalho do Dr. Mark Solms, te convido a se juntar à nossa comunidade, que é a maior e mais acessível comunidade de estudos em neuropsicanálise do país. Para além de propor um estudo mais aprofundado com uma fundamentação científica, a nossa comunidade visa trazer várias demandas como depressão, ansiedade, pela perspectiva da neuropsicanálise. E também tentamos integrar esse conhecimento ao manejo terapêutico do dia a dia de vários neuropsicanalistas. Não fique de fora dessa comunidade que tem contribuído significativamente para o aprofundamento e o trabalho em neuropsicanálise. Por último, convido você a se inscrever em nosso canal, também compartilhar esse vídeo e deixar o seu like. Dessa forma, você está contribuindo para que nós consigamos compartilhar mais conteúdos fundamentados em neuropsicanálise. Muito obrigado e até uma próxima oportunidade.